right. So I'm Rebecca Firestone, Executive Director at OpenSky Policy Institute, and we are really thrilled to have a couple of esteemed experts and scholars here today to talk to us about the relationship between taxes and migration. And I will set the stage for a moment and then introduce our panelists who are here with us today. But I'll start off by noting that we have a Q&A box down at the bottom. So as we're having conversation, if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And when we get to the end of the webinar at about a little after 1 o'clock or so, we will make sure that there's time to respond to your questions. So the reason that we're having this webinar today is this question of who stays in Nebraska and who comes to Nebraska is intimately wrapped up in some policy decisions about how we make Nebraska a very welcoming state and make sure that the people who grow up in Nebraska, go to school here, are incentivized and encouraged to stay, as well as to think about how we bring more people to Nebraska. We have some trends suggesting that there are some population declines or trends in people moving out of the state. It's something that gets talked about a lot in policy circles, and these questions of who is staying in the state and what kind of economic development and other types of incentives might be needed in order to make sure that we have a thriving Nebraska economy and a thriving Nebraska society. The question of where tax policy fits within that comes up very often, and arguments that high taxes may actually be a factor that are driving people to leave the state. So at OpenSky Policy Institute, we focus on bringing data and evidence into policy conversations, and we thought that it was really important to actually bring some high quality data into this question of how taxes and migration decisions might actually be related. So with us today is Dr. Josie Gatti, who is the director of the Center for Public Affairs Research at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. CPAR is the Nebraska State Data Center and the state liaison to the U.S. Census Bureau. And CPAR manages a portfolio of projects of over $1 million a year, ranging from community engaged research to work with the Nebraska legislature. Dr. Schafer holds a PhD in public affairs from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So Josie Gatti is going to provide us some of the latest census data to help make sense of migration trends in Nebraska, who's here, who's leaving, who's coming. Followed by that, we will have Professor Cristobal Young, who is an associate professor of sociology, sorry about that, at Cornell University, and works in the overlapping fields of economic sociology, stratification, and quantitative methodology. He studies the social policies that moderate income inequality, ranging from millionaire taxes to unemployment insurance, and his methodological work focuses on big administrative data, model uncertainty, and robust results. And he holds a PhD in sociology from Princeton University. So we have two very qualified experts here to talk to us today about the relationship between taxes and migration. And we're going to start, Dr. Schafer, Josie, with you to give us the overview of what migration trends in Nebraska actually look like. After that, we'll go over to Cristobal, Professor Young, to have you sort of give us a sort of broader sort of national picture about the evidence for the link between taxes and migration. So Josie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and OpenSky Policy Institute, for having me to discuss this very timely topic. I think I had media just on it this morning. So a common question that we are receiving, and I know is in the conversation around the state. I have some slides to share to sort of set the landscape for migration here in Nebraska, but I'm going to give you the punchline first. My research, both contextually and with direct evidence, suggests that in Nebraska, people are leaving to follow jobs. There are some that study economic development that suggest that a lot of times jobs follow people. So there's a city with a group of high-skilled workers, and the jobs are going to come to them. But what I'm seeing here in Nebraska is that people are leaving as a result of jobs. And I don't study the taxes very directly, but if they're leaving for jobs, then taxes aren't a big part of the decision calculus. So just to get into it. Nebraska's growth rate over time is mostly driven by natural change, births minus deaths. We are, and then we have a little bit of international migration. That's the light gray line, but we have been consistently net negative on domestic migration. Every year people come into the state. It's about 45,000 that will come into the state, but about 50,000 are leaving. So I also think it's important to notice that there's a lot of churn, right? There's much more movement than that group of people that we are seeing are consistently net negative in the state. But that is the question we want to explore today, that darker gray line of net domestic migration. Why are more people leaving Nebraska than coming in every year? The group of folks that are most likely to leave are prime workforce age. They're 25 to 65. They are employed. And I think this is the most important part about when we're studying Nebraskan migration trends. If I am in the workforce here in Nebraska one day, and I'm between 26 and 65, so I'm probably not retired. When I move to another state, I'm very likely still in the workforce. And so the research about Nebraskans' migrations really needs to focus on folks in the workforce. I don't think anyone's picking up, moving the next day and hanging out on the beach because they're just independently wealthy. When we see Nebraskans move, if they were employed in Nebraska, they're very likely employed in the next state they go to. And then a little bit about some of the occupations that they're in. But this is the slide that everyone sort of knows us for, and that is brain drain, or people with a bachelor's degree or more are more likely to leave than folks with high school graduate or less, or some college or associate's degrees. And we do see that over the past 10 years, that's been trending in the opposite direction. We're losing more of those high skill workers. Really want to point out that high skill workers, right, those with bachelor's degree or more, are also high wage workers. And this slide shows you that this is migration by income levels, and you see net positive and net negative. And again, you see folks at every income level being fairly likely to leave, but those earning 75,000 or more. So high skill, bachelor's degree or more, is also high wage. That's who's leaving. And we know too that those in high wage occupations are more likely to be in high demand occupations. This is actually all of the different occupations we have here in Nebraska. And this is the percent change in those occupations, 2018 to 2021, and then projections out to 2030 are the red lines. But I've made gray high wage jobs, those that make above the median income in Nebraska, and black low wage jobs, those that make below the median wage in Nebraska. So you can see those high skill, high wage jobs in the gray are also more highly demanded. They have grown faster 2018 to 2020, and on average will grow faster 2020 to 2030. In context, though, here in Nebraska today, even though we are growing those high wage jobs, we have more people working in jobs below the median wage. If you've seen me present, I present this slide pretty often. But again, we have occupations and number of people working in them, median wages, and we have more people working below the median wage than above the median wage. So high demand jobs are growing very rapidly, but still today in Nebraska, we're more of a low wage economy. So that's what makes me believe that people are leaving Nebraska because of job opportunities. We know that they are high skill. We know high skill folks are in high wage jobs, and high wage jobs are demanded here, but they're also demanded elsewhere. And that has a lot to do with pay as well. Here we see gross domestic outmigration is the red dot, so the places folks are going to, and then the gray scale behind it is the job openings rates from the Bureau of Labor's JOLTS survey. What you see is a real pattern. Most people do tend to move in the Midwest. I think that also sort of explains some of the calculus and migration decisions. Folks will want to stay fairly close to home. I think it's also a positive. They're not just leaving for far off locations like Florida and California necessarily that we can't recreate here in Nebraska, right? When you move to Kansas or Iowa, you have the same climate, you have a lot of the same values. So that's where they're moving the most, but you'll also see there's an underlying pattern there. When they do move out of the Midwest, they tend to be going to places with thick labor markets, lots of job openings, especially in those high demand, high wage, high skill jobs. Getting into some direct evidence we have on this topic and why I feel really confident folks are leaving Nebraska for jobs. This is from the Current Population Survey, a very large survey focused on the workforce done by the Bureau of Labor and the United States Census Bureau together. And they asked this question really directly, and we can isolate folks that were in Nebraska in one year and showed up somewhere else in a different state another year. Hey, why'd you leave? It's actually called why move? And new job or job transfer is overwhelmingly the largest response. And then we can actually add up there are other job related reasons to look for work or lost job. So over 43% of respondents, and these are specifically someone that was in Nebraska in one year and not in Nebraska another year, say they move for jobs. Now we do see there is a complex cost calculus in migration. There are lots of other reasons someone might leave the state, and those are all on folks' minds too. But this, when they try to get at that leading indicator of why someone's leaving, jobs are overwhelming. In 2019, we actually did some original research with the Greater Omaha Chamber on this topic as well. I will say we did the research the end of 2019, we released it in 2020, and then COVID happened, so it did not circulate very much, but we do have this data and this report. I actually saw it on Twitter recently here in Nebraska, so someone has it. But I want to tell you a little bit about the study because, again, we see a real clear jobs focus when folks leave the state. So what we did was found people on LinkedIn that had Nebraska somewhere in their profile, either in a job or family or for college, but weren't in Nebraska now. And we sent them a direct message and said, hey, did you ever live in Nebraska? Do you live somewhere else now? If so, would you please take this survey? So we found a group of folks that are this exact group that we want to learn why they migrate. And we had a sample of over 500, pretty large sample for a non-national survey. Felt really confident in the data. So this is when deciding to relocate. So when they went to another place, how important were each of the following factors? Professional growth and or development, 78% very important, another 15 moderately important. And you can see that we provided other reasons someone might leave. Professional growth and or development, number one by far. When we also asked about taxes. When you decided to leave Nebraska, were any of these costs a determining factor? Property, income, sales, housing, healthcare, utilities, insurance. Cost of housing was actually the leading indicator. Most of these folks did leave from the Omaha area, which has seen housing prices really skyrocket. So that makes sense. We do see property taxes and income taxes mentioned, 14 and 12%, 8% on sales tax, but not the number one factor by any means. Sorry. In the place you live now, are the following worse, the same, or better? You see professional life overwhelmingly better. And there's one last aspect of this we asked, what about your professional life is better? Because I think a lot of folks just assume it's only pay, right? Well, if my gross pay is greater than I'm making now, I'm out the door. And pay was important. 56% said yes, this was a select all, so you had options. But I really think this idea of job opportunities was especially important. And I think that means if I don't like my job today, without picking up and leaving the state again, I can find a new job, right? That idea of a thick labor market where there's lots of folks working in the same area. I have a great network. I have choices. I can feel maybe I can professionally grow within my organization or by switching organizations. So having opportunity to advance in your job without having to move again, because moving is really expensive. And I don't think a lot of people make that choice very lightly. So I thought that was really important. Pay also being important. And this is the demographics of that group of folks that answered our survey where they went from Nebraska. And I thought it was interesting because it aligned pretty similarly with the map using the national data on where Nebraskans go. This, though, was by zip code, while the other I just did by state. And so that is what I have. And in sort of summary, I think people move for a lot of different reasons. I think Nebraskans leave for job opportunities elsewhere.
Josie,
That's it.
thank you. Okay, thank you so much for running through both the
A lot
census
of slides,
research
sorry.
as well as some original research that you have. That's really fantastic. So I'm going to hand it over to Cristobal next, and I know you've also got some slides. So over to you for the next portion.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Let's see if we can make this work. Okay. So this research is from my book, The Myth of Millionaire Tax Flight, How Place Still Matters for the Rich. A lot of the focus of my research is on the growing tax gap between sort of red and blue states in the US, or states that have passed in recent years a millionaire tax bracket. That's a new tax bracket for people who make about $1 million a year, versus states that many states which don't even have an income tax state income tax system. So, you know, New Jersey was the first state that did this back in 2004. Minnesota, actually, this hasn't been updated because Massachusetts just passed a new millionaire tax through a constitutional amendment in their state to allow that. So there's a growing number of states that have these new taxes on very high income earners. Josie's presentation was talking about high earners is making $75,000 a year or more. We're really talking about very, very high income earning people who make $1 million a year or more. That's sort of like the top 0.5% of income earners. Anyway, in contrast to the millionaire tax trend we're seeing at the state level, there's also many states that don't have a state income tax at all, like including big ones like Florida and Texas, and you know, in your neighborhood, South Dakota, Wyoming. So a question that comes out of this is, you know, can some states essentially tax the rich while other states are not? We could pull out a lot of quotes. This is always my favorite just because it was so snappy. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie: ladies and gentlemen, if you tax them, they will leave. Okay, very confident views on this. But really this comes down to a question of what's our right mental image of really high income earners? Are they mobile millionaires who are looking for low tax places to live? Or are they embedded elites who are strongly attached to the places where they build their very successful careers? Okay, so gonna focus on analysis using US federal tax returns, microdata from the US federal tax returns. This underlying research is done in collaboration with the US Department of the Treasury. So I have individual tax records for all millionaire income tax filers for all states. This particular analysis is from 1999, over 13-year period, 99 to 2011. The N here is about 45 million observations, and that represents about 3.7 million unique millionaires. So 3.7 million people who made $1 million a year. And we can track these individuals over time. We see them over the entire 13-year period that they're filing their taxes. You know, for comparison, we pull a 1% sample of all tax filers, allows us to say, are the rich different? We track people as they change the state from which they file their federal tax return. So our focus really is on taxes and migration at the very top of the income distribution. Okay, so I'm going to interrogate this question across three sort of sub-questions. First, where do millionaires live? This is the map of millionaire density. That's the number of millionaires per 1,000 population. And you know, what we see is they're very heavily concentrated in the New York metro area, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, Nevada. And then across the country, you know, every state has some millionaires. Nebraska, I guess, is a little bit on the low side, but there's a lot of states that have a very similar profile as Nebraska. Okay, so the question we really want to ask here is not just look at this map, but say, how is this connected to the tax rates in different states? So basically, you're going to pull this data down and compare it to the tax rates to give like a basic long-term analysis. And this is what we see. I don't know if this bar is getting in the way of your view of this. It is of mine. Down on the bottom here, we have the state level tax rate on top income earners, on millionaires. So like the top tax rate. And here we have millionaires per thousand population. So over here we have the zero tax states, the states that don't have a state income tax on millionaires. So you've got Florida, Texas, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Wyoming's in there. And then as we go over to the right, we got higher and higher tax rates. Essentially, there's a flat relationship. So, you know, we see these outliers, Connecticut, New York, Washington, DC, Massachusetts have really high millionaire densities. But if we thought that there was a big connection between taxes and where millionaires want to live, where millionaires are living, there should be this downward slope. High millionaire concentrations in low tax states, millionaire populations declining as the tax rate goes up. Keep in mind that the basic features of the tax system have been in place for generations. So New York and California have always had high taxes since like the 1930s. Florida and Texas, Tennessee have never had high taxes on top income earners. So, you know, folks have had generations to sort themselves into their families into low tax states and still not what we see. Okay, are millionaires highly mobile? Key part of this question. So simple graph here, migration rates by income. What we see is, first, let's just look at the general population. That's income up to about $150,000, and we'll look at millionaires. So we start here. Highest migration rates are among low income earners, people who are struggling to get by. These are people who are making, you know, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year as reported on their tax return. That's the highest migration is among the poor, and then it declines. Migration rates decline with income. The more money you make, the happier you are in place, the less likely you feel the need to move somewhere else. That's really in line with Josie's principle about people moving for opportunity, for job opportunities. So in general, migration rates decline with income. Now, what happens when we get to the millionaire set? Are these sort of jet setters who, you know, can scoot around the country wherever they want? Well, they can scoot, but do they change their residence? Overall, we see, well, you know, there's a grain of truth to this idea of millionaire mobility. Millionaire migration rates rise a little bit. This is getting to people who make $5 million a year. These are the super elite in America. Overall, millionaire migration rate is 2.4%. It's about the same as people who make $50,000 a year. And it's much less than the poor. Okay, so third question. Okay, so there's low migration rates among millionaires, but of that migration, how much of it is tax induced? And here's normally where we get into a lot more complicated regression analysis and statistics. But for the book, I figured out how to make this, the complex statistical analysis, pretty simple to understand. So let's start. So the question ultimately, do millionaires systematically move from high tax to low tax states? Just seeing the people move doesn't say anything about why they move. Did they move for tax purposes, for jobs? We want to see that they move from high tax to low tax states before we call it tax migration. Okay, so this is net migration by state, starting with a very sort of descriptive look at this. You can see the migration. So you can think of this as a heat map. The states coded blue are states that see net out migration of millionaires. Millionaires are leaving those places on net. And the orange shaded places are places that millionaires are moving to. Florida is a really important one. I couldn't shade this one dark enough to capture the extent of migration to Florida. So again, what we want to ask is this a reflection of tax migration? You know, are these the high tax states? Are these the low tax? Are the ones in orange the low tax states? If so, that would reflect tax-induced migration. And there's a pretty strong geographic pattern to it. So anyway, here's the way. So like I say, normally this is at this stage a pretty complex gravity model, but I figured out how to explain the results of the complex analysis pretty clearly. But we do. Well, yeah, and sorry, got ahead of myself. These are the tax differences. So here in Nebraska is 6.8% on top income earners. It's about average for the US, and some of its neighbors have lower taxes, many of its neighbors have very similar tax rates. But we want to see how much is this map, this map, if you get the intuition. What we're going to do is basically take, over this 13-year period, the 47 million tax returns of high income earners, capture every case of a millionaire moving across state lines, and then just put them into 3 bins. People who move to higher tax states, that is, they move to a state that charged them a higher tax rate. So that would be, someone from Nebraska moving to California or New York or New Jersey or something. Okay, so every case of millionaires moving that we observe in the tax data, 32% of them move to higher tax states. So that's sort of counterintuitive with the common narrative. But, I think it just means that there's a lot of very personal reasons why people move. And there's plenty of reasons why people would move to higher tax states. Like LeBron James moved from Cleveland to Los Angeles. Simple examples like this actually happen all the time. Okay, now of all millionaires that moved, 21% of them moved to a state that had basically the same tax rate. So that would be like folks in Nebraska moving to, I don't know, Indiana, or let me give me to Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, let's say. If you get the idea, moving to essentially the state that has the same tax rate as they do. So there's no tax implication of the move at all. The third and drum roll please, last bin is millionaires moving to lower tax states, which is higher than the number moving to higher tax states. So we want to think about the difference between these two. And this is where we do see evidence for tax-induced migration. If the number of millionaires, or if the share of millionaires moving to lower tax states was the same as those moving to higher tax states, we would say, well, it's just a wash, and people move around the country and the tax rates on average aren't changing. On the whole, about 15% of all movers do see a net tax advantage. So 15%, the simple way to interpret this is 15% of millionaire movers are moving for what looks like a tax reason, and the other 85% are moving for non-tax reasons. So is that a lot? So remember that the millionaire migration rate is 2.4% a year. So we're talking about 15% of 2.4. It's a small fraction of an even smaller fraction. Annual basis, about 0.3% of the millionaire population overall moves for tax purposes. So, what I like to say is like, this is enough to feed the anecdote mill and for people to see examples in the newspaper. Oh, a rich person moved to a low tax state, but it's not happening on a large scale. Rebecca, how am I doing for time?
We can probably go for about another 5 minutes or so, Cristobal.
Okay, I think that'll be perfect.
Great.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We can think about what this means for should states tax millionaires. I actually like to say that data can never tell you whether or not a state should tax millionaires. It can answer a related question: can you tax millionaires? It comes down to an optimal tax rate formula, which sounds technical, but hopefully in a minute or two you'll think, oh, it's fairly intuitive. Okay, so, and also, this formula was featured in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But we have this formula here that basically says when your tax rates are low, you raise revenue by raising tax rates. You get to some point where the tax rates get too high and people start taking evasive actions. They hide their income, they're not reporting their income, or they're moving away to lower tax states. Now, so this formula is capturing this. If you calculate this out using the migration estimates that I've seen, my migration estimate is 0.1. So what this means is if you raise the tax rate in a state by 10 percentage points, you'll lose 1% of the millionaire population. So that, if you start thinking about that from a business perspective, if you were owning a business and you could raise your prices by 10% and only lose 1% of your customer base, you're going to make a lot of money by raising prices. Likewise, states raise a lot of money by taxing millionaires because on the whole, at least at normal tax rates we see in the US is very low migration. So what this is saying that if tax migration was zero, the optimal tax rate, this is combined federal and state tax rates on millionaires would be extremely high. That's the point at which you would maximize revenues from millionaires. Not necessarily what we're trying to do, but that would be an absolute ceiling if there was no tax migration. If tax migration is really high, the ceiling's a lot lower. And this is about where a lot of states are today with their combined federal and state. What we see in the tax returns, the migration rate, this would suggest that the top tax rate would be about 68%. That's the most you could get. So, if we were going to rationalize current tax rates on millionaires, we would need migration rates to be about 10 to 15 times higher than what we see today in order to say, well, no, you can't raise the tax rates that we see today because millionaires would move away and you'd lose revenue. So, like I said, we're more up here. Okay. So, thinking about the title of this presentation, some millionaire tax flight does occur. It's just that the magnitude is small and has very little impact on the stock of on the population of millionaires in the state. Essentially, millionaire migration is too small to matter for current tax policy. So why was the intuition about millionaire migration so wrong? Basically, places are sticky. And, as people advance in their careers, they accumulate a lot of things that tie them to place. Marriages, children, businesses, things more generally that I would call place-specific social capital. Their industry and place social ties. I would point out that millionaires have a much higher marriage rate. They're much more likely to be married. Millionaires are much more likely to have children at home. They're far more likely to own businesses. And all of these things we know reduces people's migration rates in the general population and does for millionaires as well. So just give some intuition. These millionaires are already, advanced in their career. They're sort of like the late career working rich. And when people migrate is when they're young. Migration is a young person's game. And migration is really not about rich people. It's about recent college graduates, primarily in the US overall. And maybe I'll just leave with that thought because I have this sense that I am out of time and I want to make sure we have a chance for people to talk. But, I've got a fun little graph here I guess I don't have time to explain, but I'll put it up there.
Actually, Cristobal, I think we have a minute or two if you want to get into this graph, and then we'll go to the discussion.
Okay, great. Well, I've given away my punchline, but let's back it up. So what I'm doing here, we've got migration rate on the y-axis, we've got life cycle stage on the x-axis, and we're going to create an age migration curve for people at every education level. So people who never completed high school have low migration rates their entire life. It starts low and it stays low. For people who graduated high school or some college, we see higher migration, but only when they're young. See here, we're getting into mid-30s and almost there's no gap. Here's where we really start to see migration rates spike, and these are for college graduates who have an annual migration rate of 12% when they're sort of 18 to 24 age group. So this would be more like the 22 to 24 new college graduates. But again, it drops very quickly. And then the last one here is people with a master's degree or higher, professional degrees mostly. So you doctors, lawyers, engineers, consultants, and so forth. What we see in every case is migration is a young person's game. Migration is high for people who have advanced education, where they're looking at more of a national labor market for their skills, and when they're young. And migration rates just drop off very dramatically. So certainly by the time you get to middle age, basically everyone at every education level has the same low rate of migration. Now, important point here is, Migration is a young person's game, but what isn't a young person's game is making a lot of money. So the median age of a top earner in the census data is 49. Okay. The median age of an adult mover is 30. So people are moving about 2 decades before they hit their peak earning stage, where they're going to be paying the top tax rate in the state. Okay, so I think this is just a really important point in understanding why taxes aren't that relevant to migration. You know, you need to think about what's going to matter to you as a young person starting in your career. Is it the top tax rate, especially when that top tax rate kicks in at $1 million, is the focus of my research. You know, these folks might be paying that top tax rate at some point in the future, but it's a long way down the road. So, you know, the thing this really emphasizes, rich people are the wrong focus. You know, every state wants more rich people, but they're just not very mobile. Future top income earners are highly mobile. Those are the people that are moving today. So if you focus on attracting and retaining people at the beginning of their career, highly educated folks at the beginning of their career, that's really where that's when the people are actually moving. So that's the time in their life when you can actually get them, when you can tie them to state. And, you know, we don't know exactly, but my intuition says that what matters for young people starting in their careers and their families is sort of quality of life, urban amenities, things that will help them start their family, like childcare, good schools, supports for young families. And the tax rate is going to be more in the background. That's where I'll leave off. Thanks.
Okay, Cristobal, thank you so much. If we can ask you to stop screen sharing, I'll ask Josie to come back on. Then we have a few questions for you. We might need some tech support in stopping the screen sharing here.
I can't make it stop. Okay.
Oh, no,
There it is.
Okay, here we go. It's just such a good slide. All right. So we've got a little bit of time for the three of us to have a little bit of conversation, but I'll ask those of you who do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, because we want to make sure that we have some time for your questions in this conversation. So the first question I have for both of you is that maybe Josie will start off with you, and then Cristobal, I'll ask you to chime in afterwards. We hear a lot of anecdotes in policy debates in Nebraska about people leaving Nebraska because of our tax structure. But that doesn't seem to be borne out by the data that either of you presented, either Nebraska specific or more national trends. So why might that continue to be such a strong talking point if it's not supported by the data?
I agree. It is not supported by the data either way. Young people, young college educated folks that are moving are very unlikely to talk about taxes. And I'll tell you, I lived in Nevada and Texas, both no income tax states. I left. I think people think, what I will say is why I think people make the connection. If folks are leaving for jobs, jobs are ways of earning income. Income is related to cost of living is related to taxes. So the idea is not that far removed. Actually sounded that way, but not necessarily, right? When someone makes a move, they are looking to be able to afford a certain lifestyle, and taxes are a piece of that story. Where I see the challenges, I think most people are looking at gross income, not sort of adjusted cost of living after taxes. And that is actually not a very sophisticated way to think about things. I would tell young people that's something they might want to take into account when making those decisions, but we don't see folks very honestly doing that. I think also because taxes can be hard to calculate and incomes do change over time. And so it's not always clear to folks. And there are these other job related factors beyond pay that matter as well. So I understand why they do get lumped together in debate. I think there will always be anecdotes. I think there are people that have moved because of taxes. I just don't think that's the overwhelming reason why most people move.
Thanks. Cristobal, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's a popular, I think it's a common way of talking about your move. When people move and they move to a lower tax state, the first thing that, and you meet them for Thanksgiving dinner, for example, the first thing they'll say is like, my taxes have gone down a lot. Like, I'm paying lower taxes than you. Aren't I pretty clever? It's just, it's just a very natural thing to talk, to brag about. I'm sounding snarky. I'm not trying to be. It's a natural thing to say, like, what's the advantage of your state, And if you move to a lower tax state, well, that's one of the advantages. It's just easy to talk about. People will go like, okay, lower taxes, that's cool. But so it's just an accessible way to talk about things. But again, in practice, we see people moving to higher tax states. And then when they do that, they never say that they moved to that state because they wanted to pay a higher tax rate. So when people move to California, not a single one of them says, I wanted my tax rate to go up, so I chose California. So it's this one-sided way of talking. And so it comes up a lot for people who move to lower tax states, and it never comes up for people who move to higher tax states. And so it's just like this, it's just sort of like this weird asymmetry in how people talk about it. And it's true that there is some tax migration, but it's small.
Okay.
The other thing I point out is just, young people they're much more likely to be using public services. Like if you have kids, or if you're close to having kids, you're really thinking about a lot of public sector service, quality of schools and so forth. And the taxes pay for things that people value. And that's the other thing that we really just need to keep in mind, So, Kansas has made a big push to cut taxes, and it's been devastating to public services. So because the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that they'd cut education funding so much that it was unconstitutional. So, if you're a young person starting out, I want to start a family in Kansas, where they're devastating the school system for cutting taxes by a few points, So I think, it's just a much more complicated issue.
Sure. All right. Thank you both. Next question I have for you is, Nebraska right now has a workforce shortage, and Josie, you also, so we have very, very low unemployment rates, and there are several sectors of the economy where it's been challenging to actually fill positions. We also have relatively low wages compared to other states, and I think, Josie, some of your data sort of illuminated that. So given those circumstances, what do you think are effective ways to actually bring people to the state of Nebraska?
Absolutely. So we are seeing this growth in high skill, high demand, high wage jobs, right? That is where the churn is, but that is not where our economy is today, right? We actually have to do a lot of work growing those high wage occupations to be on par with other places, and to turn from what is a low wage economy today to a high wage economy. And so and then I'll also say, I think there's a lot of misperception about what types of jobs are always open. They're not always those high wage jobs. And going back to that brain drain side, you'll sometimes see lower skill workers are happy to come into Nebraska. They have in the past, because we have that lower wage economy. We have lots of jobs. We tend to actually pay competitively for low wage jobs and lesser for high wage jobs, just because of market conditions. If we don't have a lot of those jobs, there's no competition raising those wages. So yet we have wonderful institutions of higher education, right? And we are turning out lots of really skilled young people in a state. When we talk about the churn in Nebraska, Nebraskans actually love Nebraska. The amount of churn we see here is really not that much. Yeah, we're losing people to other states, but we could be losing more. There are lots of states that rank higher on that than us. And so we actually find Nebraskans want to be in Nebraska. They have connections to place. We are sticky. I think we see a lot of that. And so it's really about turning, in my opinion, it's really about turning that model of people feeling that the good jobs are somewhere else, and instead letting jobs know, wait, we have great people, really marketing the people here, that we have high skilled workers, that they do like to stay in Nebraska. And so rather than people following jobs, doing things to help people stay, and thus the jobs come to us, and really focusing, I think we really have to be very intentional about who we're trying to attract and making sure we're sort of cluster developing in those high skill, high wage areas. I think we're a low population state to begin with, so it is hard to say, hey, we have this great pool of workers, but I think we could be much better about letting people know about the really sort of premier programs we have in certain areas and how connected we are to the workforce here. Like our education system is so connected to our workforce, so we're producing high demand students that have the exact skills those jobs need. So come here to us rather than that perception you have to leave to get a good job, which I do think exists right now.
Great. Cristobal, any observations as someone sitting outside of Nebraska?
Just picking up, I mean, the standard advice that I always bring up is, the cost of housing in cities is always going to be really important for young, high education folks. They're going to want to live in the cities typically, and that's where the high school jobs are going to be. And so many cities around our country, the coasts are the most extreme example, but we're seeing it all over the country where housing prices in the cities are just exploding. And so it really is build, baby, build, more housing in cities for folks that want to live there. And anything that a state can do to help their cities grow their available housing is going to help their higher end labor market in general.
Okay.
And yeah, Josie's totally right. Retention is such a big issue that states should think about. A lot of states think, how can I get, out of state rich people? Like that's a waste of time, Think about how to retain the people who already want to live in your state. You don't need to convince people who grew up in Nebraska that it's a great state, so how can you make it work for them to stay?
It sounds like from the data that both of you discussed that there's this pool of younger, highly educated folks who are the folks who are most likely to be mobile, who I think in the Nebraska context are people who are potentially most likely to be moving, and issues of retention are going to be related to ensuring access to affordable housing, access to high quality schools, access to affordable healthcare, and those are potentially investments that could be made on the state level in terms of policy choices that the Nebraska legislature has to consider that are actually ways that could be thought of about how to retain Nebraskans and reduce brain drain. So, okay, just wanted to make sure that as I'm interpreting and sort of synthesizing some of the data that both of you shared, that sort of one of those conclusions is there's some policy level investments that could be made by the state to address this issue, and they're likely not directly related to changing our tax rates.
Yeah, really well said.
Oh, all right. Well, all right. Thank you. So another question that I have for you both is, I guess, an example of, do we see places where high income taxes are basically chasing people out of states? Because we hear sometimes about, people leaving California because the taxes just got so high. So talk to us a little bit about, do high taxes make people want to leave the state?
Yeah, thanks. So, in addition to this sort of national level research, I've done research looking at both New Jersey and California and increases or establishing millionaire taxes in those two states. And in both cases, and again, working with the state level income tax data, which is kind of research you can do in Nebraska. If there's major changes happening in the tax system, you should really try to work with the Department of Taxation to have researchers gain access to those data and evaluate what's the effect of changing those tax rates. It's a great source of a local policy evidence and insight, and it's been used really effectively New Jersey and California. So what we've seen in both cases is both New Jersey and California are places where people are moving away from, and there was strong intuition that the tax system was behind it. When you look more closely at the data, though, I mean, in both cases, people. California actually has an opposite situation as Nebraska. California has in-migration of high-skilled workers and out-migration of low-skilled workers. And that's opposite what you would expect if you thought it was about taxes taxes at the top. And, what we really see is just, the housing issue is just so incredible in California. And it's just so tight that you have people who've lived in California, families lived in California for generations, working class folks who can't afford to live in California anymore and are essentially being pushed out. And so for them, the California dream is ended, in many ways because of state and local policies that basically make it impossible for them to afford the rent there. And in New Jersey, it's a very similar thing. And you can also see this in looking at the places where people move to, which is typically to places that have much lower cost of housing. So there are places that have high tax rates and out-migration, but it's not the people paying those high tax rates that are doing the moving.
All right, thanks, Cristobal. So we have a question from our participants here that I want to bring up. This person is saying, I recognize this panel is focused on taxes and economic factors, but this discussion is missing a huge piece if it doesn't mention the potential attraction of warm weather states and social factors that many younger workers say they expect, namely more inclusive LGBTQ plus and racial and ethnic diversity and standards. So I think I might maybe rephrase this question a little bit, is can we talk more about what is it that young people are looking for when they're making migration decisions? Is it just about economics, or are there also potentially social factors involved? I'm wondering if both of you can comment on that.
So I think it's important to point out that I don't think Cristobal or I are saying it is just one thing. So when someone makes the decision to move to another state, it is costly, it is time intensive. You're giving up a lot of what you've developed in one state to go to another state. So it's probably not going to be just one thing. To make that big decision, it might have to be a lot of things. My focus both in Nebraska and on the workforce movers more generally does suggest that leading indicator is a job. Well, I would love to be enjoying warm weather in Florida right now. I don't have a job in Florida, so I can't just go there to enjoy warm weather or because I share social policy concerns with other Floridians. If I did, that would be great, but that's not an option I have available to me as someone who has to support a family and work for a living and, raise 2 kids. So while I think we do see Florida, Nevada, California, we also see lots of Nebraskans moving to Iowa, moving to Kansas, moving to Missouri, right? And so there are folks that don't just move to places because they're lovely weather and or because of social issues and values. I think kind of to that point earlier about anecdotes, once we move to the state, maybe we go, oh, and the weather's great. Oh, and it's so nice to be around a diverse group of people or to have different opportunity, recreation opportunities. So I do think the cost calculus is more than one thing, but when I focus in on Nebraskans, it just seems like those jobs are driving that. And there's direct evidence from the survey. We asked in the Greater Omaha Chamber survey, hey, do you like, the recreation and amenities and all the other things when you move? But you notice that they did like them, but jobs were still the leading factor. And in that last map you saw, they moved all over the place, not just to warm weather. We have a lot of people going to New York every year. The weather's not great. So you just really have to sort of recognize that there's going to be a lot of explanations. But if you ask someone, hey, did you have a job in Nebraska? And hey, do you have a job where you are now? They do. And it's got to be at least as good as their job here, and or the expectation that it'll get better over time, because unfortunately, most people leaving Nebraska just aren't so wealthy they can give up that day.
Cristobal, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make the same point that, again, the highest concentrations of millionaires in the U.S. are in the Northeast, in the New York metro area, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. So, they're not necessarily there for the weather, let's say. But there is absolutely an element to it. So I'd say who moves for the weather are retirees, and that's to Arizona and Florida. And Florida is attracting millionaires So Florida is outstanding. So Florida is one of like 8 or 9 states that don't have a state income tax. And out of those 8 or 9 states, it's the one state that is effectively attracting millionaires into its state. So, this sort of says like, well, if you can get that intersection of like Miami weather plus low tax, then you can sort of build a tax haven around that, which I think the city of Miami is doing and has been doing. And, if you can't quite get that exact intersection, it doesn't seem like it's really working for the other 8 states that have no income tax. They're not disproportionately drawing high income, millionaires to their states. So, whether I guess, and Josie actually said it well, it's a piece of the puzzle. But I wouldn't even say it's necessarily the biggest piece, but it's there.
May I add one thing too?
Yeah.
When someone using that current population survey data, which is really large data, and this is true for almost every state in the United States, when someone moves within a state, so let's say I'm going to stay here in Nebraska, but I'm going to move somewhere else. The number one reason on that chart is housing. So I do think after jobs, housing costs before we get to taxes costs, and that showed up in that Greater Omaha Chamber survey as well, is the next big thing folks are going to be worried about. So that's in-state movement, but housing costs are clearly on people's minds when they're making decisions about where to live. So I do think jobs, housing, and then we get into the other quality of life and cost of living factors. And they're important, but they're not going to move us.
Great. We've got one last question that's come in from the audience. I think we've touched on a little bit before, but I think this is a good one, so I want to bring it up. This question is, if tax rates were so determinate, why did Aaron Judge re-sign with the New York Yankees rather than signing with the Florida Marlins or the Houston Astros? He was a free agent and he could have gone anywhere. So I'm reading this question as sort of a comment on, for those of us who maybe are not so deep into sports and baseball decision-making, millionaires could move somewhere, but places are sticky, and a millionaire may want to stay in their existing community because that's where they have social networks and a good quality of life. But Cristobal, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I love these examples because they often go both ways. And again, there's this asymmetry. So I remember a year or two ago, there was 2 of the biggest contracts in baseball that the NBA had ever, Major League Baseball had ever seen. And the first one was somebody who was heavily recruited to go to one of the California teams and didn't. And his agent said, well, they couldn't make the tax rate work, And so then there was all these headlines in the sports news. California tax rate ruins, sports teams' chances of recruiting talent. And then the very next week, there was like, 50% even higher, like really through the roof, massive record breaking, which was into California. And like nobody said a word about it. Nobody said a word about California taxes, And so, I love these examples. You see tons of them. And when you sit down and think of them, you realize, there's lots of examples of people being really attracted to high tax states and moving to high tax states. And, it's a fun source of evidence just to sort of think about, specific concrete examples of people moving to or being really attracted to high tax states when they make a lot of money. So, yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you. Sports metaphors or sports examples can be really helpful for sort of making kind of abstract concepts a little bit more real. So we are just at time. So Cristobal and Josie, I want to thank you again for sharing some of your research and your data with us and helping us to sort of apply it to policy debates that are going on here in Nebraska at the very moment. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone who participated. And have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you again.